Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, and Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Soviet Union, were the respected leaders of their countries at the time. Their calm and cool-headed manner and time of struggle allowed them to negotiate a deal that would end the arms race and prevent a Third World War. The struggles they went through to prevent a nuclear war are shown in their summit meetings. The summit meetings between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan helped improve relations between the US and the Soviet Union, which eventually led to the end of the Cold War. By the late 1970s, the Cold War had been going on for 30 years, and people began to say that America was in retreat. In 1980, California Governor Ronald Reagan was elected president. Reagan was strongly anti-communist at the time, writing, "Every Soviet leader up to and including Brezhnev has sworn to carry out to the letter the words of Lenin, who said, 'It will not matter if 3/4 of the human race perished. The important thing is the remaining 1/4 be communist.'" President Jimmy Carter, defense spending was $134 billion. Reagan raised the defense budget to $253 billion. He also created the controversial Strategic Defense Initiative, also called SDI or Star Wars by those who opposed it. The SDI program was tasked with creating a ballistic missile defense system. SDI gave the US leverage over the Soviet Union, as the Soviets knew that if the system became fully functional, they would have no chance in a war, as their heavy investment to their missile program would be neutralized. SDI also had a large effect on the USSR itself, as it caused the Soviets to have to become more modern, which is only achievable by liberalization. This is one reason Mikhail Gorbachev came into power in March of 1985. The Perestroika movement was the Soviets' answer to having been more liberal. Gorbachev was more open to Western ideas than his predecessors, opening up the ability to meet with a strong conservatives such as Reagan. November 19th, 1985, Reagan and Gorbachev met in Geneva, Switzerland. This was the two leaders' first time meeting together to discuss arms control, and the first meeting between the world powers since the Carter administration. Before he left, Reagan said, "My mission, stated simply, is a mission for peace." Gorbachev was new to his position as Secretary General, having held the position for only 8 months. In fact, just hours after the Americans learned that Gorbachev had become Secretary General of the Soviet Union, they scheduled the meeting with the leader. The proposition came even before the Americans knew of Gorbachev's positions. Reagan, however, was determined to come to an arms reduction agreement. At the Geneva meeting, he proposed a 50% arms reduction rate and the eventual end of European intermediate-range missiles. Gorbachev said he would agree to this, but only if the US ended its SDI program. Reagan, of course, stood firm against this, even with the risk of no agreement being reached. In the end, no agreement was reached. However, one important thing did happen at the summit. It was decided that 2 more summit meetings would take place by 1987. The summit was important for the two leaders as it allowed them to create an assessment of each other that would impact how they negotiate. It also opened up the two leaders being able to work together, which is a different approach than their predecessors. No arms agreement took place at the Geneva summit, but in the words of Gorbachev, because of the Geneva summit, the world has become a more secure place. The most iconic of the summit meetings took place on the 11th of October, 1986, in Reykjavik, Iceland. It was a bleak October day, with the sun shone for only a few hours. The historic Hofty House, where the meeting took place, was not ideal for the conference between the leaders of the two most powerful nations. The area around it had no vegetation, and the building was small, the rooms such as bathrooms being used for machines such as typewriters. Reagan was now more determined to come to an agreement, saying when he asked what he wanted from the Russians, "I want to get rid of those atomic weapons. Every one." Reagan also wanted the meeting to become more businesslike, minimizing social activities with the Secretary General. Most issues were being resolved until the topic of SDI came up. Reagan continued to push his agenda that SDI could be shared with the Russians, but Gorbachev was skeptical, saying, "If you will not share oil drilling equipment or even milk processing factories, I do not believe you will share SDI." The problem with SDI was the ABM, or Anti-Ballistic Missile Agreement, signed in 1972. What the ABM agreement accomplished was prohibiting deployment of an anti-ballistic missile defense system, which are used to defend land from nuclear missiles. Reagan believed in a broad interpretation of ABM, which allowed SDI to be developed as long as its means were other physical matters such as laser and particle beams. Nonetheless, Gorbachev was in favor of a less broad interpretation, one that excluded the development of the Strategic Defense Initiative program. SDI came to be the one thing that ruined the chances of an agreement at Reykjavik. Secretary of State George Shultz said that Gorbachev had laid gifts at our feet, or accurately on the table, concession after concession. This was true, as the leader had dropped the time for ABM from 20 years to 5, agreed to the inclusion of human rights in arms talks, and agreed that nuclear weapons should not belong in the world. Yet, neither leader would budge on SDI, and thus an arms agreement in Reykjavik was not meant to be. Reagan's liberal critics and the press attacked him for not coming to an agreement. They believed that SDI, and not arms reduction, had become the major issue in the talks. Gorbachev and his administration saw this as a success, since it appeared that the US was the one in the wrong, and the USSR were the ones looking for peace. The Reykjavik summit was not exactly what the press made it out to be. Reagan stood firm to make sure that the deal that was best for the US passed. He did not what many other people would have done at the time, while not accepting a deal, as opposed to any deal, just to improve his own image. His patience would wear off a year later. In the months after Reykjavik, a disarmament treaty between the Soviet Union and the US was drawn up. All that was left now was for it to be signed. On December 8, 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan began their meeting in the East Wing of the White House. The public was excited to see Gorby in their Washington. Gorbachev made a spectacle out of it, stopping his limousine on Connecticut Avenue to shake hands with the delighted crowd. Of course, there was some opposition to the summit. Some conservatives thought the Soviet Union were the ones with a position of strength coming into the talks. In fact, contrary to those beliefs, Reagan was the one with the position of power. When Gorbachev talked about the importance of trade, Reagan would not talk about trade agreements unless human rights were talked about first. With Gorbachev having shown his hand, the talks went quickly, lasting only 3 days. On December 10th, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed by both leaders. Neither leader talked about SDI in their statements about the meeting. Both leaders agreed to limiting each country to 4,900 ballistic missile warheads. The INF Treaty was seen as a success by both nations. Gorbachev saw it as a turning point for the two leaders. Here he began to respect Reagan as a person and as a leader. Gorbachev saw personal diplomacy as a crucial aspect of foreign policy, and thus his personal relationship with Reagan and other Western leaders began to grow. The editors of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, whose magazine features the well-known Doomsday Clock, announced the hands of the clock would be set back because of the treaty. Another summit was set for 1988. The Moscow Summit of June 1988 was purely celebratory. Reagan was allowed to speak to a large group at Moscow State University. Of the many things he could show the crowd, he decides to hold up a small computer chip. He goes on to talk about a technological and information revolution going on at the time. This proved to be the final stand Reagan took against communism. By showing his people the wonders of modern technology, it forced the USSR to become more modern. With the people in support of Reagan, the Soviet Union began its slow fall. By the end of 1991, 3 years later, the Soviet Union had officially dissolved. This marked the end of the Cold War. At the beginning of the summit meetings in 1985, the Cold War was at its highest point. After its climax at Reykjavik, the tensions began to go down. At the Washington summit, the two men began to see things in a different light. Their similarities far outweighed their differences. After all, they both had one goal in mind: nuclear disarmament. Because of Reagan and Gorbachev, nuclear Armageddon was averted. The Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev summit meetings helped improve U.S.-Soviet relations and led to the eventual end of the Cold War. Mikhail Gorbachev took a stand against the doctrines of his predecessors, opening up relations with the U.S. Ronald Reagan took a stand against communism by remaining steadfast in his beliefs, causing them to have to become more liberalized. Both men overcame internal political pressures and agreed to open up communications for the sake of what they thought might bring around peace. At the beginning of his time as Secretary General, Gorbachev saw Reagan as a major threat to the Soviet Union. By the end, he saw him as a man with the same goal as himself: nuclear disarmament. Gorbachev understood the only way the Soviet Union would last was for the people to have more freedoms. In the end, though, it didn't come quick enough, as his nation dissolved in the early 90s. The summit meetings between these two leaders brought an end to the Cold War, averted World War III, and put an end to the world's largest communist state. Reagan and Gorbachev were two men who took a stand in history.